Hi, everybody. This is Saad. It's been a few weeks since my last guest, but I've got one of the rare guests this time around because I think I only have one other situation where I've interviewed a husband and wife team separately. I've had Brett and Heather Weinstein on my show, the evolutionary biologist, separately, and I've had my current guest's wife. Her name is Cynthia Farahat. I've had her on twice, and today I've got her lovely husband. Jeffrey Higgins. How you doing, Jeff?
Oh, thank you for having me. By the way, my wife could be here with me. It's not like we're having a problem. She'd be happy to appear with me. Yeah, no,
Gotcha.
she's loved your show, and you did such a great job interviewing her and everybody else that you've had on this. I gotta tell you, Gad, you're one of the great voices for free speech in the world right now, and it's so important. I've probably been following you for close to a decade.
Oh my God, thank you
Really
so much.
appreciate what you've done.
Coming from someone of your repute, it actually means a lot more to me to have a fan such as yourself than the Stanford and Harvard professors. Uh, because maybe one doesn't want to have the imprimatur of fellow academics these days because academia is going through a rough patch right now. But I just want to quickly tell people who you are, for those who don't know you. You've spent 25 years as a law enforcement career. You're now retired. You're a retired supervisory special agent who was instrumental in capturing the world's leading heroin dealer from Afghanistan, Haji Baksho. We'll talk about that. Now, by the way, I knew of you through your wife, but one day about 3 weeks ago, I was watching the series Narco Terrorism, and it was the entire show was on the capture of that heroin dealer. And here comes this gentleman, you. I'm saying, I think I know this gentleman. So then I write to your wife. I said, is this your husband? She's like, yes. And that's how I said, oh, I've got to have the great Jeff Higgins on. Let me just finish reading your bio. You were involved in counterterrorism, and then you're also an award-winning and number one Amazon best-selling author. Some of your previous novels include the book Furious, another book Unseen, and you have a book coming out on February 29th called The Forever Game. Did I cover some of the highlights, or do you want to add anything else to that, Jeff?
No, absolutely. What a kind introduction. Thank you so much.
All right. So what I thought we would do is just begin with your very alluring and exciting and intriguing law enforcement career. Just tell us what were some of the big highlights, what was your trajectory, and then we could drill down on that heroin dealer that you helped capture.
Yeah, well, I was really fortunate. I had that 25-year career. I started with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office in Tampa, Florida. And I mean, at all level, I've worked at all levels, really. I've worked with local police around the world. I've trained police around the world. So I've been fortunate to do some of the biggest federal cases. So it was a really interesting career. Ironically, I sort of got into it. I started as a reporter, and I got into it because I was looking for something exciting, and I thought it would be good fodder for books. But turned into 25 years. Once I was bitten by that law enforcement bug and actually doing some good in the world, it was really hard to get out of it. But
How did you
so many
switch from
instances.
say from the sheriff's department where one can spend their entire career doing good things to going to DEA to doing counterterrorism? What are the bridges that lead you to all of these different hats that you're wearing as a law enforcement officer?
I think change is good, right? Like it's every now and then, about every 5 years throughout my life, I've changed jobs, even if it was within the same agency. So I started in when I was with the sheriff's office. I started in patrol. I got into my first shooting 2 weeks into the job. And it was a call for a like a loud party or it was a barbecue. And we went to go talk to somebody, and he murdered a woman right in front of us, and then tried to shoot my partner, and I shot at him. It's weird when I ended up being in a lot of shootings over my career, but like that first one, right? The first time you're doing something that you've only seen on TV, it's a little shocking and surprising. And I swear to this day, I saw my bullet like go right over his gun, right over his hand.
Wow.
They say that's impossible, but I swear I saw it. But you
But
have these weird, physiological reactions when you're in like high tension incidents like that. Like your hearing shuts down, you get that tunnel vision, where you can only see what's directly in front of you. But the more you do it, the more I guess normal it becomes, and so later you just moderate your breathing and you just kind of get used to it.
statistically speaking, would it be correct to say that most law enforcement officers will go through their entire career without necessarily ever shooting their guns? Is that correct?
Yeah, the vast majority. I think that I want to say it's like 20% over a whole career, and the number of people who've been in multiple shootings is like just in the single digits. That's a small percentage, but it depends on where you are. If you're in a little town someplace, you're not using your gun so much, right? It's all informal policing where you're talking to people and doing conflict resolution and things. But I always chose to be in like the most impoverished neighborhoods, the highest crime places to actually do the job where it was needed.
I mean, you're retired now, and in a second, I want to get to the capture of the Afghani heroin dealer because that is truly an incredible story, worthy of a movie. Uh, do you miss that adrenaline? Do you miss that rise in cortisol levels and testosterone and the rest of the hormonal endocrinological system?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said I didn't. It is sort of you get used to it, and I did a lot of kind of out there on pointy edge of the spear type of things throughout my career. And so, yeah, there's a certain excitement to it. There's also a clarity to it. When you're like in combat with bad guys, those are the people you're hunting, and there they are in front of you, and they want to kill you, and you want to kill them. And there really is that clarity of just forgetting all the paperwork, forgetting all the nuance and gray areas. You're just, I kind of miss that too. And
Wow.
even when you're a cop, you're out on the street, like you save somebody's life, you just save somebody's life. There's no figuring out how is what I'm doing now going to like affect the mankind over the next 10 years or something. It's right there in front of you. So you get that like immediate gratification, which is nice. So yeah, I miss a little of that, but honestly, a lot of the guys I worked with are died over the years. Both in the military, like I was embedded with the Special Forces A teams, and I was in combat with the SEALs, and I worked with our DEA fast teams and other DEA units around the world. And so at some point you start getting that feeling like, you can only do this so many times. I've had mortars landing near me, rockets going over my head, RPGs fired at me, people shooting at me, like eventually it doesn't matter like how good you are. There's so much luck that really determines the outcome of those violent confrontations. So
Were you able to, once you segued back to civilian life and you retired, of course, many people go, and I hope you don't mind me asking this, but many active duty folks who then retire, whether it be in the military or as, law enforcement officers, will have all sorts of mental health issues. Were you able to
what are you
evade all
saying,
that?
Gad?
No,
What
no,
are you
what I
implying?
no, no, not that you have any problems, but it's there's PTSD, there is all kinds of emotional trauma. I mean, I spent after we escaped the Lebanese civil war, I actually talked about this with the gentleman who killed bin Laden, literally. He was on my show, Robert O'Neill. And, I was telling him that I had nightmares for about 25 years after leaving Lebanon, where it was always one of two recurring nightmares. I would either wake up because I just realized that I ran out of ammunition as the bad guys are coming in, or that my gun jammed. And as I was telling him that story, he goes, "Oh, many of us have had similar dreams. It's called the warrior dream." And so there's always going to be a mental health related signature when you're going through these difficult situations. Did you experience any of that?
Not really. I know it's a real thing. I definitely had those dreams. Like I think everybody in law enforcement over the years has had the dreams where their gun won't fire, or it's jammed, or it's coming apart, or you're trying to get it put back together in time. These kind of just stress related dreams. But yeah, no, luckily no PTSD, or at least it hasn't manifested yet. Let's see what happens during this show.
Now, do you think that it is the fact that you've been able to be so fortunate as to avoid many of these difficult pitfalls? Is it just your unique disposition that allowed you to have the armament, the emotional armament to protect yourself? And or is it that when you returned, there was a social network that allowed you to deal with some of those difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those things,
Yeah.
right? It's hard to say when something doesn't happen, how do you prove the negative? But certainly, having support of like agencies and honestly, when you're in combat, and the same thing was true when I was in patrol as a police officer, at the end of the day, you get together and have a beer together and talk things out. And just that camaraderie and understanding that everyone's kind of going through the same thing is really helpful. I think the longer you hold on to something that's bothering you, right, the worse it becomes, and that's when you start having these chronic problems. But if you just get it out, or I'm not a person to hold my feelings in either, so I'll just tell people if something's wrong, and
Well, by the way, I did exactly the same thing yesterday. I'm not sure if you saw it or not. We talked about this offline that I've been going through some difficulties with the tax realities. And I just put out a tweet. I knew that there'd be people who'd attack me. Oh, boo hoo hoo, successful guy complaining that they're taking all your money. But I felt that psychologically, emotionally, it would do me good, even if it's a, very large platform that I have. It's as if I want people to bear witness to what I'm going through. And just putting out that tweet around, I don't remember when it was, maybe 11 o'clock at night or something, made me feel better psychologically.
No, absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with complaining about taxes or complaining about somebody punishing you for success, and in a progressive system like you have and like we have here, right? I'm in Virginia. It's the same thing. It's just the better you do, the more they take, and you get to that point where it's really hard to. And by the way, you can see this all over the place, right? Where look at all the socialist countries, look at all the former Soviet bloc countries, right? Why work if they're just going to take it away? Why work if you're not going to get something in return? I mean, it's just basic human nature, and I don't know how many times we have to see the same thing repeated before we stop doing it.
I know. So I've used this quote before in several of my writings and in my books. It's by a quote by E.O. Wilson, who's a. Are you familiar with E.O. Wilson? Do you know the name?
No.
No. E.O. Wilson just recently passed away. I just finished actually his autobiography called The Naturalist. He's a or he was an entomologist by training. He studied insects, specifically social ants. He was an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, a big intellectual hero of mine. And at one point, when he was asked about the virtues of socialism and communism, do you think it's a good idea? His answer is absolutely brilliant. He said, "Great idea, wrong species." Because what he means there, and I think some of my listeners and viewers have heard me explain this before, but others not, so it's worth repeating. Social ants are perfectly suited for communism because you have a singular reproductive queen, and then you have a whole bunch of indistinguishable worker ants and soldier ants. And therefore, this idea of we're all going to be indistinguishable from each other makes sense within that particular phylogenetic history of that species. Humans are not social ants. Some of us are taller, shorter, better looking, less better looking, more fortunate, less fortunate, harder working, less hard. So when you are imposing a socioeconomic political system, to your point, that is contrary to human nature, it shouldn't take a fancy professor to say it's always going to fail. And as you said, it has failed repeatedly, but usually the rebuttal is, well, because you haven't tried true socialism, true communism. If only the next round we implement the true one, then you will see that it truly is a utopia.
And as an evolutionary biologist, I'm sure you know this better than anyone, but actual happiness, like deep long-term happiness, comes from bettering your environment and bettering yourself. I mean, you're not built to sit in the mud, right, and get rained on. And so when you take that away, when you take away that ability to create, it makes people deeply unhappy. And I worked in several former Soviet countries, working with their police, working with intelligence, and I had one guy. I remember one was a Romanian police officer who told me how he hated capitalism because now he had to work. In his old job, he didn't have to get out of bed, he didn't have to do anything, he didn't have to produce. But I would rather have to work a little bit and have like 5 times the standard of living, or have the ability to work harder to improve my life than not. And I mean, just look at the people coming across the southern border right now, right? I mean, you have people, a lot of people, not all of them, but a lot of them are just fleeing economic hardship. Look at what happened to Venezuela. Look at what happens everywhere, right? The system is tried. It's insane that we're still talking about it.
Did you see I just saw this clip earlier. I was on the treadmill trying to run away my existential frustrations at the taxation theft that I just experienced. Did you see the noble illegal immigrants who were just caught because they had beaten up some cops in New York City? Did you see their reaction as the camera caught them?
Yeah, I did. These are they. It was a mob beat up a bunch of NYPD officers, and they were released on no bail. By the way, like that's a welcome to New
Exactly.
York.
But did you see when they caught them, or I don't know if it was before or after, rather than exhibiting some contrition or shame or fear, or they were giving the finger
Yeah.
to the camera. So imagine the chutzpah, right? That's the right term. And in Arabic, you'd say wahane, right? It's this fu that is really deeply felt, right? So that there is no sense of shame. I come into the country illegally. I beat up your police officers. I'm now arrested. And my response is I give you the finger because I know there will be no repercussions to me. A society can't withstand that level of lunacy. What do you think,
No,
Jeff?
it's a deep contempt for the society, and we bring it on ourselves, right? People understand strength, they understand rule of law. When you don't have those things, I mean, like you can't have open borders in a socialist system, right? I mean, just the math doesn't work. This is first grade math here. My wife is an immigrant. My grandfather and grandmother came from Lebanon, by the way. I'm half Lebanese,
Oh, is
so
that right?
yeah, that's right. They came from they're in Brumana, which is just in the hills above Beirut.
But you don't speak Arabic because if not, I'm gonna break out the Arabic.
I'm smiling a little because my Arabic consists like 99% of profanity. And if when my wife sees this right now, she's going to be holding her breath.
So we'll skip the profanity, but I think I could imagine what some of those juicy lines might be. All right, I want to get back, and then we can go into all kinds of political stuff, and then I want to talk about your authoring career and your latest book. A lot to talk about, but tell us about that incredible story. Number one heroin dealer in the world. You were instrumental in capturing him, and as I was trying to prepare for the show. I think they might have even mentioned it in the narco terrorism thing at the end. He's been now released, correct?
That's right.
All
Yeah,
right, so tell us the whole story leading up to his release.
so I was in New York, and I went to Afghanistan because I was actually one of the first people to arrive at the North Tower, the Twin Towers, when they came down on 9/11. It was
Wow.
myself and an NYPD officer and a Suffolk County district attorney investigator were the first. And I vowed on that day, standing in that rubble, that I was going to go after terrorists. And so when DEA opened up its office in Afghanistan, this was in the end of 2003, I volunteered and I became the assistant country attaché there. So I helped stand up that office. So very early on when we first got there, we were training the local cops, we were arming them, we were going on missions, we were trying to get them to be able to be somewhat functional, right? To bring the rule of law, from like teaching people what is evidence to actually going out and targeting bad guys. And from those early days, Haji Bacho's name was coming up. This is back in like 2004. He was clearly the world's most prolific drug trafficker. Period. Right? He dwarfed everybody else. And so I was integral in the investigation itself. Like I was, as I told you before, I was living with special forces, the operational detachment Alpha, out in the Nangarhar province, which is by the Khyber Pass on the border with Pakistan. And I was running sources there, so we'd go in for 4 months at a time, and I'd develop sources and go out, put on local clothing, and go out into the rural areas and set up meetings and gather evidence, and then target these high value targets, put together criminal cases against them, and then when possible extradite them back to the US. We actually did the first case where we the first narco terrorism case, like based on the intelligence that we gathered over a couple of years. Congress passed the narco terrorism law, the 21 960A law. And so I was able to make the first arrest and the first conviction under that law. But Bacho, the whole time we were out there, was one of the biggest drug organization in the world. And a little secret, I work for DEA, but I'm libertarian, and I actually believe in the legalization of most drugs, which you won't hear a lot. But I've always targeted drug organizations and transnational criminal groups that were killing people and doing just horrific things. And his certainly was, like in this particular case, we had his people threatening to boil one of our witnesses in oil. They had firefights with some of our police officers trying to kill people that were involved with the case. I mean, these are in places with no rule of law, and like Afghanistan. It's the war, it's warlordism, right? The guy with the most people, the most soldiers, the most troops. And someone like Bacho had influence and corrupted officials like all over the world. He distributed to 22 countries. When he ended up being picked up in Pakistan, and then the Pakistan government delivered him to the Afghan police, and then we extradited him back to the United States. And so, and then I did the trial with him with, you know, it was our special operations division with our Kabul country office, and we in our fast teams and everyone who contributed to that. So it was a, you know, a lot of people over several years put together these cases, but in the end we convicted him on some just kind of basic 101 narcotics enforcement, doing undercover buys with one of my sources, and you know, getting him on the telephone and doing tapes and things like that. But
I
uh,
remember the gentleman who, you had kind of dropped him off by his compound, right? I can't remember. Was his name Muhammad?
Yeah, they were all, so everyone was working under aliases, because as you could, even by the way, even people testified under aliases in federal court because the threat against them was so great. I had a
Right.
case before this one where one of my witnesses was murdered as soon as he went back to Afghanistan, and then his brother was attacked, and you know, I mean, so it's a very real threat. And of course, now that we're not there, which is just tragic, we have, you know, all the police officers we worked with, all the intelligence officers we worked with, they're all under threat as well. I saw pictures of a guy I indicted for terrorism in New York at the day, like in the days that as we were pulling out, going house to house looking for witnesses in some of these cases. I have one of my sources took a picture of him coming, the guy coming, this Taliban commander coming out of his house. You know,
Wow.
he was
So
he was
do you,
sit-
do
he
you,
was sit- go ahead.
do you feel that, I mean, having lived in that culture for however, how long did you spend in Afghanistan?
So I was there from 2004 to 2010, not all the time, but a lot. Like sometimes one year I went like for 3 4 month deployments, almost in a row. Initially I was there for about 15 months straight. So I think I spent 3.5 4 years over that period of time actually in country.
Do you feel that, so I mean, there are several causes as to why those societies fail. I mean, we can argue that, an Islamic theocracy is probably not the way to organize society. But even if we leave that part aside, which is a big if, that's a big gorilla in the room. But if we leave that aside, is the endemic corruption in these societies so enmeshed within the DNA of the society that it's almost impossible to extricate yourself out of the death spiral of those societies?
Yes, but I think that's a symptom more than a cause. You know, I think at a very basic, like philosophical level, you have to have property rights. You have to believe in individual liberty. You know, you have to believe that individual life has value. You know, some of these Judeo-Christian Western ideas have to be there at the very beginning, because otherwise nothing else makes sense, right? Right? If the individual, if there isn't some sanctity to the life of the individual, and what they earn doesn't stay with them. Of course, this is a tough conversation for us to have today after you've done your taxes, you know,
Indeed.
but you know, this without those philosophical underpinnings and the economics that come along with like capitalism and free markets, I think it's yeah, you will inevitably have corruption, because why not? Right? Like
Yeah.
what is the counter argument for corruption if property rights don't really exist?
Exactly right. Well said. Okay, so then you catch the guy, you put the case together, he's convicted, sentenced to, I think, a pretty long sentence. I don't know, 40 years or 30 years, something. What was the original sentence?
I think the original one was life, but it was beyond his lifespan for
Okay,
certain.
there you go.
And we charged him with multiple things, and what one of the charges was set aside. So the actual narco terrorism charge was set aside. The drug charge we charged him with, the undercover buys of heroin, stood. He remained convicted of that, but he had to get resentenced because they set one of the two charges aside. The problem was, in the ledgers that we found, I mean, just the stuff that we found and could prove, in one 12-month period, Haji Bacho distributed over 123,000 kilograms of heroin. And just to kind of put that in perspective, that's 19.7% of the world's heroin that was distributed that year, right? So almost 20% was this guy's heroin that I could prove, and I know I didn't have all the records. So he was by far the most prolific heroin trafficker in history, probably the biggest drug trafficker period in history. And when he was resentenced, he was given I think a 10-year sentence or whatever it was for that drug charge, even though nobody had ever been charged with more drugs. That we introduced that evidence at trial, not just the couple kilos, or we ended up buying 4 kilos with two different deals with him, and one of those charges was dropped, and the other one he was convicted on. But we showed what he did during that period of time. And I mean, during that period of time, there were thousands of deaths and hundreds of American soldiers were killed, and he was directly supporting the Taliban, and he was working with poppy farmers to grow poppies and encouraging them to deal in the heroin trade as a form of jihad. You know, so I mean, it was more than just here's a drug guy, right? Like I told you my feelings on drugs in general, anyhow. But this was somebody who was directly supporting the Taliban, and we had a witness who was present when he was giving money to the Taliban and providing arms to the Taliban. You know, and so when he was not sentenced properly for the drugs, it was obviously quite upsetting. When he went back, I'm sure he went back as a hero. You know,
So what led to his release? How did that happen?
so I have to be careful because it deals with classified information.
Oh, okay. So I don't want to
But
get you in trouble.
no. So yeah, I don't want to get in trouble either. So let me just put it like this: another agency had some derogatory information about one of the witnesses. And under US law, anybody in the government who has anything that could be used to like impugn character, for example, has to be turned over to the defense. But we didn't know about this information until later through further investigation of something else. And then we turned it over to the defense and we found it later. So we could have retried Hachibacho on those charges, but you know, witnesses were dead, people were hard to bring over. The trial itself cost, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and just the feasibility of retrying him was so slight.
So it's just some technical issues that have nothing to do with big philosophical, deontological issues caused the guy to walk away, as often happens, right? You didn't read the Miranda rights exactly verbatim, therefore you can't admit the evidence or whatever, like stuff like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, the you know the material, which I won't talk about, had nothing to do with this case. You know, so and it wouldn't have had anything. It wouldn't have affected a new trial at all either. You know, but it was just it happens. But even with that charge being dismissed, and listen, I'm a big believer in individual rights, and I'm a big believer in people being able to, you know, like a government should turn over everything. A government should be able, you know. So I kind of agree with all that. What I don't agree with was the fact that this guy who's responsible for 20% of the world's heroin that year got like a 10-year sentence. Like that's a problem.
Wow. Is he, do you know at all if he's back to his old tricks or has he retired in some little cave somewhere?
I'm sure he's back to. I mean, I'm sure he's sitting in Kabul right now, being feted as a hero. You know, I mean,
Wow.
when you like in the military was guilty of this over and over and over again. They would detain terrorists, and then but they would have no plan for them, right? So they would hold them for a period of time, and then they'd release them. And it was so much worse than just never detaining them in the first place, because as soon as they were let out and sent back to their village, they come back as heroes. Look, they can't hold me. I'm a, you know, I'm the Teflon Don syndrome. And so you got, you know, like that. So that's one of the reasons, by the way, I was pushing judicial solutions in Afghanistan. The Khan Mohammed case was the first ever narco terrorism case, and we were using U.S. law to go after terrorists, right? Who are you know, in the drug trade as a way to support terrorism. And you know, it is a solution, one of many, but we have to do something. We were so frustrated by, you know, catching people, this catch and release of terrorists. There's a perceptual problem in the West where people think, wow, if someone's doing this horrific act, there must be a logical reason for it. And that's not true. When someone's, you know, a radical ideologue, when someone has a religion pushing them to do something, they're not thinking rationally. And I don't know how many times people have to tell us what they want to do before we believe them. We're constantly saying what they don't really mean that, and they do mean that. You know, so our approach to like, you know, to like radical Islamic terrorism, for example, because that's what I spent a lot of my career dealing with, it couldn't be more wrong. You know, I mean, like look what just happened in Israel. You know, it look the most horrific acts since the Holocaust, and you know, and the leadership of Hamas is telling you why they did it, and we're still making excuses for them. It's insane.
So you may or may not know this, but I mean, I've talked about exactly this issue at length for several decades, culminating in this book, in the Yellow Book, in the Parasitic Mind. I have a chapter, chapter 6, which I titled Ostrich Parasitic Syndrome, where I specifically focus on various manifestations of ostrich behavior, right? The metaphor being that you bury your head in the sand and you go la la la, I don't want to hear it. And exactly to your point, I actually list, I say, okay, well, here's the number of terror acts that have been committed since 9/11 alone by one religion, where they specifically state that they are doing it for the religion. And now, by the way, that counter is up to about 44,000 plus since 9/11 alone in nearly 70 countries, right? So you couldn't make up data that would be as unassailable and as unequivocal as that. And yet I then list all of the Western intelligentsia offering the real causes for why these things happen. And some of those quote real causes, and for those of you who are going to be listening on podcast, real causes is in air quotes, uh, are really, they come out straight out of my satire, but regrettably, they're not satirical. So, example, it's due to beard bullying, right? So, who amongst us didn't decide that if they were beard bullied, they would head off to ISIS and join Raqqa, I mean, go to Raqqa and join ISIS to throw gays off rooftops? It's also due, it may surprise you or not, Jeff, due to lack of art exposure. So, for example, you're walking around some young Muslim guy in Brussels, and you're not being exposed to enough Chagall and Dali and Renoir. And that's when you decide, well, listen, not enough art in my life, time to kill the kuffar, right? So, Bill Nye explained to us that the Bataclan attack in Paris was actually very clearly caused by climate change. So when you have Westerners being willing to espouse such insanity, is there hope for us, Mr. Higgins?
Is there hope? I'm a very optimistic guy, but no, Gad, there isn't. Like, I'm not in a good place with this right now. I mean, and the fact that we've lost our ability to reason, I mean, that is really the biggest problem. Like, you talk about it being satirical. Everything is satirical now. You
Right,
can't make up, like, the Babylon Bee can't get far enough ahead of a
right,
story to make it satirical. The things people believe, and the lack of truths, and I think it comes down to a basic tribalism, and it's, so anything the other side says, even if that was my opinion 5 minutes ago, has to be wrong because they said it. And
right,
we're definitely in the United States, at least, we're in that position right now. It's whatever the Democrats say is wrong, whatever the Republicans say is wrong, right? And there has to be this objective stance, or even the belief in objective reality, right? That we can measure things and that something could be wrong, or how about some nuance? How about this one politician's doing some good things, but he's also doing some horrible things? How about that? That's a legitimate position. But I know so few people who can actually do that, or so few people who can actually break themselves from their entrenched positions, as if changing your mind somehow makes you a lesser person, and so if we can't have this debate, and now, of course, by the way, thank you for what you're doing, because, like, these, like, long form interviews, your really courageous stand for free speech. I mean, this is the whole ball game. I mean, really, this is the whole ball game. When you're getting, censored on, people, you, me, a lot of people censored on social media, just literally, you can't break into mainstream media with certain ideas. When the government itself, the CIA, the FBI in the United States, are pressuring people to silence people with opposing viewpoints to an administration, I mean, that is pure totalitarianism, right? And unless we can have this, like, open forum of ideas, we'll never get to the truth. And when you start to self censor, and we're there now, right? You're afraid of cancel culture. That's the beginning of the end. So, honestly, the only way out of this, and I said there's no hope. There's always hope, and right, and there's light. Everything's a spectrum, and the pendulum swings back and forth. But what you're doing is the way we get out of this. You gotta not stop. We all have to stop demonizing the opponent of an idea and actually focus on the idea, right? And get away from all the logical flaws and discuss it, and then try, and then we can compromise, then we can agree to disagree on things. And but until we get back to that, and we were there like 30 years ago. I don't know well, I do know what happened, but this whole politically correct cancel culture movement is destroying
right.
everything.
You know,
Sorry
you
for the rant, but
No, no,
it
no, no.
means a lot to me.
That's what the long form format is for. You at the start of your response, you said about, how people are unwilling to change their minds and so on. And it reminded me of a recent exchange I had. I was appearing on a British psychiatrist's show, and he asked me a question which, in retrospect, you'd think that many other people would have asked me, but I think he might have been the first one to ever ask me that question. I thought it was a brilliant one, and it's going to speak to what you were just talking about. He said, of all your years as a psychologist, as a behavioral scientist, as a professor, what has been the finding about human behavior that you found most surprising and shocking? And so that kind of took me aback because, I've had a long career. There are many things I could talk about, but what's the singular most surprising? And then I paused and I said, the inability of people to have the intellectual honesty to change their opinions.
Yes.
Uh, it's once you are and now here I'm going to get slightly academic. In chapter 7 of The Parasitic Mind, the title of the chapter is How to Seek Truth. And I'm arguing that there is an objective way to seek truth. But I start off with kind of a pessimistic outlook on that. I quote this very long quote from a great book called The Enigma of Reason by two French psychologists, where they argued that our faculty to reason did not evolve to seek objective truth, but rather it evolved to win arguments. And therefore, oftentimes, I can present you all of the evidence in the world. Here, Jeff, here is all of the historical, economic, political, philosophical, psychological evidence that suggests that socialism and communism is doomed to fail. Guess what? That evidence is not going to sway you because, God forbid, you would ever change your opinion in light of incoming information. So I think that's probably the thing that epistemologically makes me the most pessimistic, because sometimes I start questioning myself. I say, okay, I'm putting all this effort. I mean, I know I'm flipping some people, but those people are flippable. The really hardcore, rigid ideologues, is there any amount of evidence that I could ever offer them to change their mind? And regrettably, I think for some of those folks, it's a resounding no.
I've heard even people that I used to respect, like intellectually, who've recent years have talked about the propagating lies because the end goal, the outcomes were too important to be left to chance. And by the way, so someone who believes in like moral relativism, you can't argue with that person. There is no end to that, except for maybe over time they'll realize how ridiculous what they're saying is. But even that argument, right, that reason is there to win an argument, evolution would say no, because you can win every argument and still end up dead. It's using reason to find reality is what helps us survive as a species. And so one of them clearly leads to survival and the other does not.
Right, very interesting. Okay, so I want to get, I hope it's not an abrupt segue. In a sense, it isn't, because I think your novels deal with some of the issues that we're talking about. So, okay, you come off from, you get out of this career as a law enforcement, you're hanging around in Kandahar or whatever, and you're with the special forces. Then you retire and you say, all right, act 2 of my career, I want to be a successful author. What was that transition? What was your process? And I ask you this because I often get people who write to me and say, hey, Dr. Saad, what's the secret to being a good author? So do you have any recipes, one, two, threes that you could share with us?
Well, the secret to being a good author is write, right? Don't talk about that you have a book. Actually sit down and write the book. And, they say it takes about 1 million words to achieve some mastery in it, sort of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours. And there's some truth to that. So write. Also, you have to learn the craft and the business. That means, following podcasts, going to seminars, joining, going to conferences, joining writing groups, getting critique partners, like actually learning it. And it does take a while. If you're doing that, if you're constantly trying to better yourself and learn, everything you write will be better than the predecessor, right? And so I'll go back, I'll finish a book and I'll go back to the beginning to start editing, and I'll cringe at what I just wrote, because I'm actually a better writer at the end of that book than I was at the beginning. I
Right.
don't know if you've experienced this as well,
But
but
but it's interesting because probably not as much as what you're saying. I think because the process of writing nonfiction is inherently different from the process of writing fiction. And so that was actually, I mean, in a sense, you've teed me up perfectly for my next question, which is, I think you've done a bit of nonfiction writing, but mainly fiction. How does your process change depending on those two genres?
Well, you're right. It's completely different. So the first thing I wrote upon retiring was the story of the first narco-terrorism case. So it was my story. It's nonfiction. I tried to sell it at the time. I got an agent with it. We had a lot of interest, but I didn't sell it. So it's one of those things that sort of sat on a shelf, and I will go back now. This is 2017, so I'll go back and rewrite and then try it again. But I also pivoted right after I got out, because when you're in the government and you have a security clearance and everything, you're very limited in what you can say and what you can do. So that was 2017. That was right during the time with all the defund the police, right in the beginning of the demonizing police. So I wrote a bunch of essays and articles actually showing facts, about what the numbers looked like in defending police. I mean, if there's a bad cop, if there's a racist cop, if there's a bad shooting, everybody should be pointing it out, and it happens, of course it happens, right? But it's not statistically significant. And the numbers, like every year, there's something like there's like 10 million arrests, about 700,000 US police officers, sworn officers, about 10 million arrests. And out of them every year, there's actually more unarmed white people are killed than black people, right? But the percentage, the percentage is skewed, because there's blacks are like 13.5% of the population or whatever. But so I started actually going into like government documents and showing what the numbers were, because it really matters. Like if there's an epidemic of racist police shootings, we need to stop it. And it turns out not only is there not, it's almost non-existent. Like about every year there's 1 to 2 dozen unarmed black men who are shot in the United States. And I would go through, and I was a tactical instructor for DEA. I've been in a lot of violent encounters, many violent encounters, and I would go through them, and I would analyze each one. And each year there's a couple of them that are bad, for sure. Every year there's a couple just outlandish like shootings or things, and the cops go to jail. But most of them, even if they're unarmed, people think unarmed and they think, well, that's a bad shooting, but it's not true. A lot of them came at the end of high-speed chases. A lot of them came when the suspect was wrestling for the police officer's gun, or the bad guy had just been shooting at the police officers, and so when you look at them all, there's only a couple. And then so when you look at these numbers, you say, okay, blacks are, it's like a third or whatever the number is. I've written about the exact numbers of all the unarmed shootings. But then you look at like the black community's involvement in crime, right? Like 54% of homicides, 54% of robberies, et cetera, et cetera. Once you account for that, and as a scientist yourself, you look at confounding variables, right? And once you account for their participation in criminality, the disparity goes away completely. In fact, it actually reverses in a lot of cases. And there's been a bunch of studies about this, from Roland Fryer, who
I was
are
just gonna say, I was gonna ask you if you're familiar with Roland Fryer's work. Yes.
yeah, and there's a dozen of these done by different universities, and they all show the same thing. And then there's all these other like societal and sociological variables, like the percentage of fatherless homes, poverty. Like almost all crime is done by young men, right? And the black population is significantly younger than the white population. So just that one fact alone would mean there'd be a higher level of criminality. It's nothing to do with race, obviously, right? It has to do with age and young men and testosterone. And so when you look at all that, it goes away completely. So I just got, I did a lot of media about it, over a couple of times, but it's not going away. And every election cycle, it comes back, and we'll probably get more of it, this year leading into the U.S. elections.
But in a sense, what you just said, well, not in a sense, in an exact sense, it speaks to my earlier point about most people are unwilling to be swayed by facts, right? So when you said that the same faulty narrative keeps coming up, it suggests that you are impervious to this little pesky thing called data and analysis, right? Because I can't get rid of the narrative, right? So I'll give you a great example of that. So I still receive, pretty much almost every day, something from the university about how to be a better ally to women, as if women in North American universities are indistinguishable from little girls trying to go to school in Waziristan. That's the narrative, right? And so I had once shared the data from the US government. Okay, you ready for this, Jeff? 4 levels of educational attainment: associate's degree, so half a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctoral degree. So 4 levels of educational attainment, broken up by 5 racial categories, Hispanic, indigenous, whatever, white, so on. So basically the matrix is 4 by 5. 4 levels of attainment by 5 races. And in every single one of those cells, you can calculate the ratio of male to female in that cell. So I can go black, associate's degree, is it more men or women? Indigenous, doctoral degree, is it more men or women? So out of 20 cells, Jeff, guess how many cells women outnumber men?
20.
Yes, sir. We have a winner, Jeopardy champion. So the narrative is women need constant allyship because we live in Waziristan. The data could not have been doctored to be the exact opposite of the narrative, but no amount of data that I show you alters the fact that I receive emails saying we need to be. By the way, my dean is a woman, my departmental chair is a woman, my associate dean of research is a woman, but I need to find ways, if I apply for a grant, to argue how I'm going to be a better ally for women in universities.
Yeah, I mean, it's because it's narrative, right, and not conclusion based on analysis of facts. And my master's is in criminal justice, and I have a statistical research focus, and it's just basic like 101 research and statistics. And and you have to look at that, but the narrative survives because the narrative is the point. And so it's not you're not the average person who's like listening to a podcast or hears something and then repeats it, right, because that's what they heard on the news. But the people who are actually like propagating these lies have a political agenda, and
Yeah.
they're not shy about talking about it. Like it's interesting that everything from like a disparity in gender with wages to climate change has the same solution: end capitalism.
Yes.
Like
Yeah, but it's interesting because so I've often thought about, so but why is it that this reality exists? So I think it's a couple of factors. Number one, most people regrettably are cognitive misers, which is a fancy way of saying they're intellectually lazy. If Barack Obama, peace be upon him, or George Bush say that Islam is peace, then it's a lot easier for me to say, oh, well, my president said Islam is peace, therefore Islam is peace. The actually going through the hard work of putting together the evidence to either support the fact that Islam or peace is peaceful or not is too effortful. So I want to use some kind of simplifying heuristic to make sense of the world. So number one, people are cognitive misers. Number two, we are a storytelling animal. We love stories, right? That's why literature, that's why fiction works, right? Because our big brain is fed by powerful literary narratives. So if you concoct a story for me, that's going to be a lot better than if Jeff Higgins comes with all of his statistical analyses. I don't give a shit about reality and truth. Tell me a story that sticks, and that's the problem. What do you think?
No, I completely agree, and it is so much easier, and it's also there's social pressure, right? So if you have like basically a communist cadre, and that's what it is, right? Intellectual communist cadre who are pushing pure socialism across the West, who hate everything about like America and other Western powers, who want to replace this, and they're using race. They're using dissension. I mean, these are Marxist 101 tools that they're using to try to tear down institutions so that they can replace it with something else. And don't trust me, ask them, because they say it all openly all the time,
Right.
so you just have to believe them. But so that they craft these narratives, and they spark something in us, right? The idea of like a police officer, somebody that we have to trust to protect us, is committing like a racist crime. What's more horrific than that? Like, I mean, that makes me ill, right? And I was spent 25 years in law. It makes us all like sickened by that. So I think there's this natural inclination to want to stand up for the underdog, but the problem is it's not happening. Or when it happens, you actually take away from when it actually happens, right? Because there are racist incidents, there are bad
Yeah.
cops, and we all need to go after them. But when every time there's a shooting, you call the cop a racist, even when there's not a single piece of evidence or any inclination to believe that racism had something to do with it, what you do is you make people question all of it.
Yeah.
And I've been writing about this for years and years and years. And what you're seeing now is what happened in like Miami in the 80s. They tried to like diversify, so they lowered standards, and they made the racial makeup of their police department the goal, which by the way is fine because there's different cultures, and it's great if you can have cops from all these different cultures, and they can help with sensitivities, and they can help with communication and all this. But when you drop like a meritocracy in place of that, you cause huge problems. And what I predicted, like it's got to be like 6 7 years ago now, is you're having people who don't want to get into law enforcement, right? Like, why would you in the United States want to be a cop right now? Like, why would you? You might want to protect your community, you might want to do good, but there's a good chance you would do your job exactly as trained and get indicted for doing it. So who would want to do that? Plus, you're getting demonized in the press and called all these horrible things. So we are seeing it. It's already happening, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? The cops that are there now
Yeah.
are retiring in mass, and fewer good candidates are coming in. So what you're going to end up with is a lowering of the quality of candidates. And when that happens, the people who are going to suffer are the people who are in impoverished neighborhoods with higher crime rates. So the
Exactly.
very people we say we're protecting by demonizing the cops who weren't doing anything wrong. And by the way, sometimes they were, right? They're definitely departments that were doing a lot of bad things, and we should focus on them. But I'm just talking in general, and now you're actually hurting the very people you claimed you were going to help, if that was your goal. But if your goal was to tear down the police and the institutions so that you could replace it with a utopian vision of the world that you have, then you don't care. And
Indeed.
that's what's happening at the top.
Indeed. As you were talking about sort of corrupt officers, I thought of the movie. I'm sure you've seen it by Al Pacino, Serpico. Do you remember that movie from way back
Oh
in the
yeah.
70s? Yeah, yeah. So that was one of my early exposures as a young kid to Al Pacino, and then he became one of my favorite actors. Okay, let's talk about, with the time that we have left, your book that's coming out on February 29th. Actually, the day that your book comes out is the day that I will be speaking about all of these parasitic ideas at Arizona State University. The reason why I know that is because it's a leap year, February 29th. Tell us about your latest book, The Forever Game, if I remember correctly, right?
Right. So the Forever Game deals with artificial intelligence. I had a friend of mine who's the CEO of an AI company years ago, and he told me that another CEO of another AI company was going to friends and family and offering to download their consciousness like as like a beta program. And I'm like, wait, what was that? We're really at this inflection point with AI, and we're seeing
Yeah.
it all over the place. And so it's kind of a timely book, but all my books kind of have a theme, and in this one, it's really the nature of artificial intelligence and what it says about humanity and what it means to be human. So I have a special agent, Adam Locke, who quits DEA because his girlfriend is terminally ill, so he can take care of her, and he joins his brother's AI company. Then his brother's dies under suspicious circumstances, and Adam learns that this life saving technology can be deadly. So the whole thing deals with like what are the types of AI that people are experimenting with now, and what does that mean? I mean, it's fantastic stuff, right? When you can have like nanobots that go into your
Yeah.
bloodstream and find cancer and cure things, it's amazing. But like what it means, like actually when you're downloading, okay, so this is real. So this is real. A couple years ago, this is like 5 years ago now. I read an article about a lab that was doing like some kind of high density MRI, some type of MRI, and they were watching the synaptic connections when somebody was having a memory. They were able to recreate that in the next room in a blind study in a blind way.
Wow.
Fascinating, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
so so what does that mean? What does that mean when you can download your thoughts and your memories? And as AI gets to that, fourth or fifth generation, right? That next level of AI where it's sentient, or that it surpasses human ability. What does that look like for us? So anyhow, that's what the book's about. I mean, I say all that it's a thriller. So my books they're fast paced, they're thrillers, they're fun, but having these underlying themes, I think, is always interesting.
As you were mentioning that study, I think, and I'm wondering if it's the same study that I'm thinking of. There's a study, if I'm not mistaken, by a group of UCLA, or at least the lead author might have been at UCLA, a neuroscience group, where I don't think it was memories, but it was, let's say there are 8 different types of thoughts that you could have. I'd like to touch my computer or whatever. Since each of those have a different neuronal activation pattern, they were able to then guess what the thought was based on the neuronal signature at higher level than chance. So it's a very similar idea to what you're talking about. So it's unbelievable. Now, if one of your movies, not one of your movies, one of your books were turned into a movie, and one of the characters was an incredibly good looking, wise guy, can I immediately assume that I would be the guy who would be playing that role?
I mean, who else could possibly play it? Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's why you were the big DEA agent. You understand reality. Uh, hey, Jeff, any other project? I mean, I know you've got a looming one coming up on February 29th, so I don't want to look beyond that, but are there other projects, whether they be authoring or other things that you're working on that you'd like to take this opportunity to promote? It's
Oh
your
yeah, well
chance to do so.
thanks for that question. The
Sure.
I have another book called The Havana Syndrome. That's the working title.
Oh,
That's
is
coming
that
out.
the wave stuff, the
Yes.
mysterious? Okay,
Yeah,
go
so
ahead.
yeah, it's U.S. diplomats all over the world, and then and other nationalities, right? Canadians as well, who've succumbed to something, right? That's called the Havana syndrome. And a couple years ago, I read the CIA put out a report and said that these are anomalous health incidents, right? And so they're blaming a psychogenic effects, and
Right.
yet that can't possibly be true, you know. And I have actually interviewed people who were part of this, or who suffered from this, had brain injury from it. But just to give you one example, there was a national security officer, a national security advisor in, I think it was across the river in DC. And she was stricken by the Savannah syndrome, right? Like with all, you know, the loss of balance and the sound in the ears and all that. There's like a whole host of symptoms, and people are like, oh, psychogenic causes. But her dog had a seizure at the same time, you know. So unless you feel like her dog is watching television and open to suggestion,
Or he's
there's
just
something
mimicking
else
her
going on.
behavior.
That's right. Okay, yes, that's actually a much better explanation than what I read in the CIA report.
Right.
So you know, so anyhow, that's what that book's about. It's an international thriller, and it goes to places like Estonia and Ukraine and places that I did operations in the Dominican Republic, and so I think that's a lot of fun. That's coming out with Severn River Publishing in 2025. And then I have another one, called Shaking, which is like a pure mystery. It takes place in a little town of Harvard, Massachusetts, where I grew up, and that's coming out in the summer of 2025 with Running Wild Press.
Very cool. So, are most of your books in one way or another related to, your history, in that, most people write about what they know about. And so is that what's happening in your case? Or do you try to traverse landscapes that are otherwise completely unfamiliar to you?
Well, doing what you're suggesting would make a lot more sense for branding, but they're all thrillers, right? So they're
Okay.
all mystery thrillers. But my first book, Furious, is psychological suspense, and it's a woman who's lost a child, and her husband takes her across the Indian Ocean to get her away from everything, and well, bad things happen because it's a thriller. You know, the second one, Unseen, is about the Muslim Brotherhood and an actual real life terror
A
conspiracy.
topic that your wife, I believe, knows a bit about.
A bit. She's probably the world's leading expert on that. By the way, her book, The Secret Apparatus, is required reading. If you're interested
Yes.
in terrorism, you have to read that book. It's the only book like it, and she's the only one who had that information. She's studied this stuff for decades and decades, and you know, DHS is reading it now, and it's she's all over the world. She's in academic libraries all over the place. But read that book. I really recommend it.
That's fantastic. Well, you rarely do you have a marriage where both partners are the epitome of honey badgers. You are both certified as honey badgers. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jeff. Stay in touch, and as I said offline, if I ever make it, I'm sure I'll make it to the Washington area. I look forward to meeting you both in person. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.